All right, welcome everyone to our August 21st meeting of the Task Force on Reimagining Public Safety. Today we have a few agenda items we'll be discussing, including we'll have some updates and discussion of technology and live streaming and public schedule. We'll hear updates from our subgroups. In the following order, we'll go our use of force subgroup, our community engagement and healing subgroup, and our human services calls for service subgroup. Each subgroup will have about 30 minutes total time, including discussion and Q&A with the rest of the task force members to kind of give us updates on what's been discussed in their meetings over the past 2 weeks. And then we'll have a closeout. So that is our agenda today. So first item we wanted to just discuss with everyone. So I know that we've had a number of conversations about live streaming our meetings or figuring out the technology to do so. Just knowing my position with city government and the limitations that we have with technology, essentially why we've been recording these meetings instead of live streaming is that every single one of you would have to have a Microsoft Teams account to be able to be admitted into the meeting. And then we would have to, coordinate with City Council essentially to use their platform for hosting. And so what I wanted to ask task force members today is if someone has a Zoom account that they would perhaps be open to using so that we could live stream to the City of Richmond's Facebook page. It's much easier to do it from an outside organization than it is from city government because we are not allowed to initiate Zoom meetings. Our platform is Microsoft Teams, and I think as we've all joked, Microsoft Teams is a little bit more difficult to use than Zoom. So I just wanted to open that up for a quick discussion to see if anyone has a Zoom account that they think could host all of us and then stream to the city's Facebook page.
Let me check with my organization. We might be able to use one. Can you hear me, Maggie?
Yes. Is that Natasha?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Glad
that would be.
This is John. We'll check with RBHA as well. We have a Zoom account. I'm not sure what the capacity is, but I assume that would stream through our server system. And so I'll just check with my IT department to see if we can make that available.
That would be really helpful. I think that would be a lot easier for folks because I think we can make it so that it's not necessarily everyone else joining as well, but if we stream it the way we can have our participants but folks can listen in to it live versus the recording. And if you don't have a Zoom account, I think you can still jump on, right?
Yeah, you typically can join with the access code and password.
Great. All right, so Natasha and John, if you all want to check on your end, that would be really helpful.
Maggie, this is Amon. I just wanted to offer, I don't know to what degree, as long as everyone was okay with it. I have a personal account that I use for other business that, I think that for some reason or another, the other organizations weren't available. I mean, mine is definitely available. And I'd offer, to allow us to use it for the meeting as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amon. I appreciate that. Yeah, so Natasha, John, if you all want to check first, and then if we can't make it work on your end, then Amon, we'll make it work on your end. I think that so our next public full task force meeting will be 2 weeks from now. So I think if we could just plan and I can coordinate and work with you all to see how we can make sure that's set up for that next meeting would be really great. But in the meantime, the recording from today, once it comes down from the Microsoft Teams cloud, which sometimes can take a while because it's a 2-hour meeting, we will send that out in a press release and post it to the city's social media and YouTube like we did last week or 2 weeks ago. So we'll do that again. The other item I just wanted to, we had talked about, I talked with the co-chairs of the task force about creating a public timeline that would essentially show the 2-week, meeting schedule for this large body meeting, and then show the essentially the dates for the initial reports, which are due September 21st. And then the final report, which is due November 5th. So those, it would kind of show this the full kind of public meeting schedule, if you will, once we get that set up with the Zoom account, and then the report due dates. So we're working on that as well. And I just wanted to discuss that with anybody to make sure anybody had any questions or concerns about that. But that was a recommendation of the co-chairs. Daryl, did you have a question?
Did you want me to talk about the drive?
Yeah, that would be great.
So what I've been trying to do with Maggie, what we've talked about is trying to make the information that is being shared with the committee available to everyone. And we wanted to keep it in a shared drive. So I did create a separate Google account for the RVA task force, hoping that we would be able to, everyone would be able to have access to the drive. So I've been trying to add people into the Google Drive to share it, and it keeps telling me that I've reached the maximum number of participants. So I'm working with Maggie on maybe perhaps figuring out what another option is, or maybe working with somebody to help. And if anyone has any suggestions and more computer expertise than myself, feel free to let me know, because I've not encountered this problem before, but for some reason I've been having a lot of difficulty being able to do that. The other difficulty that I think is also happening is there's a lot of people with government email addresses. So anything with like a .gov, I believe that I don't believe that's going through. So I'm gonna try to see what we can do to troubleshoot that as soon as possible. Hopefully we'll have that problem resolved by next week. So yeah.
Thank you, Daryl. All right, well, unless anyone else has any initial questions up front here about any of the items we've discussed, I think we could kick it over to our use of force subgroup meeting to present out on the work that they've been doing over the past 2 weeks.
Good afternoon. My name is Sheba Williams. I am one of 3 co-chairs. Myself, Courtney Winston, and Natasha Crosby are the co-chairs of the use of force subgroup. I will be presenting just our basic goals that we've discussed over the past 2 weeks. We did a lot of discussion around the policy of use of force, and we wanted to focus more on the implementation and how to present better results for community transparency. We talked about the use of force policy as it stands now. We wanted to do evaluations to have more consistent data output for public consumption and an annual report for the public. The last data update that is available to the public was published in 2016 from Richmond Police Department. We have been evaluating and presenting recommendations for the hiring process, how to address racial bias analysis, and how to do continued support for officers as they engage with the community. We also discuss having better community insight into policing. Currently, there is an issue with public distrust, and there are a lot of community concerns. So we're trying to figure out how to have a dialogue on a larger scale for learning, and then hopefully listening on the behalf of the police. We came up with quite a few goals, and these are just like in our first 2 weeks of meeting. We discussed a lot about the psychological effects before hiring, but we dived into what happens continually as police officers work. We also had recommendations around mandatory mental health evaluations. Currently, mental health evaluations are offered, but they are voluntary. Um, we talked about different community programs that Richmond Police communicate in, and our largest concern was the disconnect between community and policing as it stands now. The use of force subgroup is tasked with figuring out where the divide is. We had a lot of discussion in this group around the policies and how they're impacted, but we did not do a deep dive into how to change. So I think that we are open to communication from the overall body and the community on what needs to change from here on out. And that is a very, very brief overview. We wanted to tackle data transparency, communications and education, reporting of use of force. So right now, the use of force reporting is basically left up to discretion of officers, and with community reporting, we wanted to expand that for reporting purposes for people in the community. We talked about having an anonymous reporting source. I do know that there is a bill right now going through special session regarding having an anonymous hotline that is statewide, but we took initiative to discuss this in advance. We did a lot of talking about having a better complaints and compliments process to address things like identifying the officer that you come in contact with and having a way to report back whether you have a good or bad experience. We discussed CIT training and mental health support, and we discussed lack of leadership training for police officers once they get to a supervisory position. And we absolutely discussed the field training program and community access points and how to address new laws as they come through. I think every July 1st is when we have new laws that come out. That is in a nutshell.
Thank you, Sheba. Did any of the other co-chairs or any members of that subgroup want to add anything to what Sheba has said so far? All right, so open it up to the rest of the task force to ask questions, make suggestions. Please feel free to just jump in. You don't need to raise your hand or put it in the chat. Just feel free to jump on in.
Well, good. I am in a position where I can't raise my hand, so I do need to, if I may ask, I do have a question. Thank you for that overview, Sheba. That was very, very, it seems like y'all had a very rich set of meetings. There's two questions that I have that I'm not sure if this is something that you all perhaps came across in your discussion, or if it's something that we can get answers to. But in terms of use of force, I'd like to know how it's defined. I mean, obviously there are a set of parameters by the police department that determine use of force. And I guess the question that I have around that is more so, some of the public discourse has been around, I guess, for all relative purposes, applying charges based on what people perceive as use of force. And so can we get some sort of clarity between the use of force policy, certainly as it is now, or even what we might imagine it to move towards? How is that defined in relationship? Oh no, better question is, what about a police officer's action then can be defined as criminal based on what people perceive as use of force? Or can anything be, or is there anything that can be defined as criminal? Because I think that's where some of the larger discourse, some of the prominent discourse, in the community is stands, where folks are saying, well, we've been mistreated, we've been treated this particular way, and lack of a better term, it seems like, police are just don't have to be accountable. But if there's a policy in place and the policy allows for actions up to a particular extreme, then at what point can you hold them accountable? If that makes any sense.
This is Will Pelfrey at Virginia Commonwealth University. I can answer your question. I just posted in the chat a link to the Richmond Police Department's use of force policy, and that defines all the elements of use of force: deadly force, excessive force, less than lethal force, the force continuum. And you can look through that and get a feel for definitions of some of the issues you raised. The idea or the issue of criminality is a different one, and that's an artifact of the Commonwealth Attorney's decision making. So there would be two decision prongs for that process. The first would be the Virginia law. Was a law of Virginia broken, and the second would be the city law or city policy and the police policy. And if police acted outside police policy, then they could be considered in violation of agency policy, but that doesn't necessarily translate to criminal activity.
Right. So let me be a little bit more clear about the question. I've read the use of force policy. I don't need to reread that. Based on what you just said, it sounds to me that the only at least leg of accountability right now is based on the policy. So as long as an officer operates inside the policy, there really is no measure for criminality. That's what it sounds like.
Nope, that's not correct.
And if I'm wrong, okay, then if I'm wrong about that, I need to be clear. I need to understand. Well, where is that not the case for?
Sure. The Commonwealth of Virginia has laws on what police can do and can't do. And a Commonwealth attorney would consider police action relative to Virginia law. There's also the potential for federal law. And if a U.S. attorney believes that local police have violated a federal law, then they can charge officers as well.
So
if I could just jump in also, I am aware that Delegate McQuinn has introduced legislation, which of course we don't know whether or not that will be successful or not, but in the special session, she introduced a bill that would address the use of excessive force by police officers, and also that would require a duty to intervene if one officer observes another officer using excessive force. And it's like 3 different prongs. One would be a class 1 misdemeanor. One, if the person used excessive deadly force or the person suffered from extreme harm with permanent injuries, etc., would be a felony. And there were 2 felonies. One was going to be a class 6 felony and one a class 4. So the committee may want to chat with Delegate McQuinn or either take a look at that legislation that she introduced on Wednesday.
Do you have a bill number handy, Bertie?
I do not. And if I get it, I can send it to someone to put it in the chat. It was just introduced and I don't have, unfortunately, I don't have that. I have a copy of the rough draft of the legislation, but I don't even have the final copy of it. But if you probably go under Delegate McQuinn's legislation, it should be listed there and I can get the number for it.
Thank you.
Okay.
I will say that as a part of the use of force subcommittee, that there seems to be an effort to move away from actually looking at the policies of use of force. And so I think we have all decided that next week we will definitely dive in much deeper into the actual policy written and the lack of accountability that it gives.
Yes, I believe next week we have Dr. Pelfrey presenting, so looking forward to it.
I think for full transparency from those in the community who deal with like very real interactions, we read the policy and we see the policy, but there's a very real disconnect from what's in the policy and what is considered discretion on behalf of the police and what the community perceives as harm. I think that it's being avoided in every light because there's a written policy that is supposed to be the gold standard and there's accreditation for RPD, but there are very real harms that are taking place in the community that are being avoided and not addressed. So I think that when we say we have this policy that is great and it's well written, when a person has a concern, a very valid concern about harm that is done, and And it may not look like George Floyd having someone's knee on their neck for 9 minutes. It may not look like being beat with the billy club like Rodney King, but there's harm that is taking place, and people have very real concerns about how to address those. So I think that we all get the policy. I think we all read the policy because we distributed and shared between each other. But we want to talk about what the concerns of the community are and why there's so much distrust in the community. And I hope that clarifies what, and I'm not speaking for Iman, but I think that kind of clarifies what we're getting into. We're talking in circles around what the policy is and what the reality of what community suffers from is.
Oh no, that's precisely on point. Sis. I appreciate that. A lot clearer than I was articulating.
Okay, and this is Carol. Natasha and Iman, what you want to look at is the practice versus policy. So whenever there's an investigation, practice is you're taught one way and you do something else. So you're right on target. So you want to identify what the practices that are outside of the policy. Okay?
Thank you.
Bill, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm just wondering if the subcommittee has been looking into or making inquiry about numbers of complaints of use of force. Thinking back to our co-chair, Ms. Edmonds's instruction to us that we should be data-driven. I'm not expecting that every use of force has been reported, but I think that it would be useful to try to get some feel for what kinds of force, what kinds of complaints are out there that might be escaping whatever the administrative system is. If that's causing concern, then it should be addressed as part of what we're doing.
I think that for us, the last report that RPD put out, it was from 2016. There was a concern that the June use of force report that was put out lacked the data that reflected things that happened in the protests. So we asked the question around it, and we found out that it was incomplete. I think for capacity reasons or staffing reason or what have you. So we don't have up-to-date data. If that answers your question.
Okay. And this is Carol again. Carol Adams again. I have been working on gathering the data for you. So as soon as it's finished, I'll get it out to Maggie, and she can share it with everyone.
Carol, I see your hand.
Yes, Maggie. I said I've asked for the data for the reporting, the complaint reports, in the outcome. So they are working on processing that for us. And as soon as I get it, I'll share it with you, and you can share it with the committees.
Thank you, Carol. And then Daryl, I think I see your hand.
Well, I'm not on that committee. I was wondering, based on what I'm hearing, is there or will there be any plans to really, from the committee, talk about what are some of the gaps, or perhaps what are some recommendations for getting some data maybe from the community, if most of the data we have is coming from what I'm hearing is most of the data is coming from the police department. Are you all considering other ways to collect information that we could possibly make as a recommendation to fill any gaps that may be coming up as we're talking?
So we discussed a better way for the community to make more anonymous reports of use of force and different concerns that they had, because I personally in the community have concerns about people giving their full information and making reports. Like, that is a very real concern that people have that are in the community. So we were thinking through ways that we can make sure that the officers, one, identify themselves and give that information to a person to not just make complaints, but also make compliments on, I don't know how we say having a good arrest, but just having that data available, because a lot of times you don't have access to who you interacted with, and also having an anonymous reporting source that the community can communicate more, because what we found from the current system is, of course, our website is difficult to navigate for some people. That was something that we discussed, and also an anonymous reporting method.
Do folks have any other questions or suggestions for this subgroup? Compliments?
I do think that's a great idea in trying to pull in data from the community. I also think that it would be really great for us as a task force to actually take a look at the Obama Foundation's 21st century policy on policing, because there are a lot of great progressive and forward-thinking recommendations and actionable items there that can really be used in RPD to help gain the trust of the public, to help better the individual experiences of police officers, because I'm sure this isn't fun for people who want to police to have to go out and be in this kind of environment. So how about we start talking about the things that people are asking for and trying to implement the changes that are necessary in order to make all parties happy and agreeable and able to move forward. Because what I don't want to see happen out of this subgroup and this task force as a whole is that we come out, we issue our recommendations, and the community thinks that it's a bunch of BS. And now we're months longer into this, when all of us, I think, are here to try to prevent the the next uprising in Richmond because of a lack of accountability coming out of this task force.
Natasha, I think that's exactly right. And without any other questions for this subgroup, I think that feeds really, really directly into our community engagement and healing subgroup, and how there can be collaboration between those two groups to really, think through a meaningful plan to engage the community, or put forward recommendations, for the mayor to meaningfully engage the community. So with that, I would love to turn it over to Ram and Bertie with our community engagement group.
All right, good afternoon. I guess I will start. Our subcommittee, Community Healing and Engagement, we've met twice virtually, and we've agreed to have our recurring meetings weekly by Zoom every Tuesday from 2 to 4 p.m. The first meeting focused on the concept of synergy, recognizing that the result of our combined effort is greater than the sum of our separate parts. And we spent quality time reintroducing ourselves and sharing individual viewpoints, thoughts, and ideas as we went through 3 questions that we presented to the committee members. The first question was, what do you bring to the committee and what do you want to take away from it? The second question was, what resources are you engaged in or are you aware of? And then the third question was a visionary question. If you had unlimited power and resources to heal the Richmond community and provide public safety, what would you do? And this exercise gave us additional opportunity to get to know each other better and to listen to many different ideas on community healing and engagement. Members of the committee shared a very wide range of information, programs, resources, and ideas. We also discussed the question of expanding our recommendations and our narrative to include the issue that financial and economic conditions of the community directly correlate to opportunity. My second meeting focused on putting into place strategies for collecting, processing, creating, and reporting out our recommendations for prioritizing community healing and engagement. And Dr. Rambagat started off our meeting with a mindfulness moment. It was designed to create and to center our spirits and minds as we listened to two information gathering presentations. So the first presentation we had at that second meeting was one from Officer Carol Adams, and her presentation was on community outreach programs that are sponsored by Richmond Police Department. She presented a very comprehensive list and a description of current and past community policing programs and initiatives. We then entertained questions and comments from the committee members about Officer Adams' presentation, and we had a pretty robust conversation about that. The second presentation focused on community and organizational-based community healing and engagement programs and initiatives. And our committee chair, Dr. Ram Bhagat, shared an extensive list and description of numerous programs that are available in the Metro Richmond area. Again, once again, we entertained questions and had a robust discussion about his presentation. Other members of the committee shared information about additional programs and the need to have more wrap-around services and more coordination of effort between organizations, agencies, and faith-based programs. We also talked about the structure, strategy, et cetera, for gathering information and then reporting our findings and recommendations. And we also talked about our technology challenges, policies, and protocol. We sort of worked through some of that. We have a member of the committee who is going to schedule our recurring Zoom meetings. And we also have another member of the committee who set up a Dropbox for us to be able to share information. So we worked through some of the logistics. We also presented a flexible, tentative sort of work schedule structured so that we would be able to complete our written report and our recommendations in a timely fashion. We distributed that to all of the members of the committee. And again, it's flexible, so it may change a little. Hopefully, we will definitely be ahead of schedule or on time. Our committee also discussed a potential theme for our subcommittee. It actually came up at the first meeting, and then we talked about it a little bit at the second meeting also. The intellectual property for this theme is owned by Dr. Ram Bhagat, and the theme is something that he referred to as massive resilience. And we thought that pretty much captured where we wanted to go with community healing and engagement, that, you know, instead of massive resistance, that now we are being resilient, and it's going to be massive resilience. But anyway, we're going to discuss that theme and other potential suggestions from other committee members at our next meeting. We challenged each committee member to think about and brainstorm ideas for our next meeting to help the committee identify. And we wanted everyone to bring back immediate goals for the committee, short-term goals, and long-term goals for community healing and engagement, and an implementation plan for each of those goals, and a list of community resources, past and present, and potential, with names and contact information. And then we just pretty much reminded our members of the next meeting for the full committee, which is today, and our subcommittee. But we just want to say that we're energized and ready to work. That's sort of the highlights from our two meetings.
Thank you, Bertie. Ram or anyone else from that subgroup, feel free to jump in and add and make any additions, or we can open it up for questions and suggestions.
Bertie, she did an excellent job capturing the essence of both of our meetings. So it'd be great to hear feedback and questions from the rest of the task force.
Okay, let me just add this. One of the other things that we did talk about that I didn't have in that report, and that I didn't talk about, was the possibility of having a town hall, a virtual meeting, to get some input from the community also. So that was one of the things that we talked about doing to gather additional information.
This is Daryl Fraser.
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple just comments. I believe that when we talk about community, I think we understand when we say community, we're talking about Richmond, right? But there are other communities within that that have varying needs. So I just want us to be mindful of that because sometimes we talk about community, and sometimes when some people are talking about community, they might be talking about a specific community. So wondering when we use certain language, if we can be more, sometimes consider all of what that looks like, because some communities within Richmond are going to require different methods of engagement, if that makes sense.
I agree with you, Derek. This is Tori. I think we often use community to describe two very distinct group of people. Some folk use community to describe the residents that actually live in the community, and then some people use community to describe the business organizations and nonprofits in that category. So I do think we need to somehow distinguish who we're speaking of when we use the term community.
Okay, we hear you, and we are well aware that we had that discussion both days for our committee meetings. We have on our committee a very diverse and well represented group of individuals who come from all parts of the community. So I think we appreciate that, and we will have that covered.
Birdie, when you say that you would have that covered, again, I make no secret about it that I'm here to be the voice of what I consider a lot of times the voiceless. Can you give me an example of what you mean you would have that covered, specifically in Richmond, as tends to be ostracized, has no real communication in terms of in the courts. And so could you try to give me a straight?
Okay, you broke up. I don't know if it was my computer or you. I didn't hear the whole question.
When you say you have that covered,
yes,
I make no about who I'm here to, I guess, be the voice for. So I want to know specific, you know, I believe are over police. Could you give me a strategy or like what you guys tend to do in terms of that particular population who seem to be, and when I say the courts, the projects, the big.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Than others.
Yes. Okay, I can give you an example of that. We have a number of people on the committee who raise these same issues on the subcommittee who raise the issues, and there's some of us who are well aware of issues. I've been a volunteer in Richmond Public Schools ever since I came here. And it's been for an extended period of time, and the whole time that I was on the bench, there were things that were brought to my attention or that I noticed that I tried to make a difference. One of the things that I've talked about quite often is the zero policing, zero tolerance rather in certain communities. So that's one thing that we need to talk about, and we'll take a look at in reference to why are there some communities where the police are charging people for small infractions with the intent, I guess, to see if there's something else going on. We also we have people from on the committee that are diverse in reference to, we have Latinx. We're looking at issues concerning LGBTQ community. And, you know, we understand that the issue is a complex one, and we are, you know, ready to, when I say deal with it, we are well aware that there are lots of issues that are occurring, and that the policing is different depending on where you may live in the city of Richmond. I'm not sure if you all can hear me. My computer is doing something crazy.
We hear you fine.
We can hear you well.
A large portion of your answer was like kind of blocked out. So I'll just email you because I couldn't really hear what you were saying.
Okay, so see, I don't know if it's my computer or yours because yours was going in and out of on me also.
So I'll just add, this is Lisa Moon, and I'll just add, I can appreciate the approach that this subcommittee is taking to address some of the healing issues. I think the only comments that I would add that is that, you know, the vulnerabilities in each of the pockets of our community is different. And so I think that we just need to be mindful uh, of treating everything as if it is the same. So because the needs are so broad-based and varied across the city of Richmond, and I just think we need to be real careful about how we're going to address the vulnerabilities of those communities, the sensitivity to those vulnerabilities, but also in the varied ways that we need to interface with those communities. And I think so that means that we're going to need to kind of get a sense of what those communities bring to the table in terms of um, the issues of resilience, the issues of trauma, of course. I'm sure you guys have already addressed that. I know that Dr. Bagat and Judge Jameson is, you know, are very familiar with the very nature of, along with the rest of the committee members, the varied nature of the needs across the city. So I would just make that comment. And so in that, the approaches perhaps of healing may need to also vary. I think that would just be an additional comment.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Yes.
I agree 100% with that comment.
This is Sheba. Just a statement. I think that it's very important to go back to Dr. Utsi's presentation and start from the beginning. Like, healing is hard if there's no recognition of harm done. I know in a lot of our conversations in the past couple of weeks, we ask questions and we get a very straightforward academic answer about what policy states and things like that. So I encourage everybody to put the paper away and look at like real life situations when we're talking about healing. So harm has to be acknowledged first. And I think that we've been going into these past few weeks disregarding that. So, you know, everybody comes from different places and there are very different situations and experiences, but we all have come together to recognize the fact that harm has been done and we're looking for a resolution for it. So when we're talking about healing, we have to go back to the beginning of where harm started and how we get to a solution together to alleviate that harm. Before we can go into any solutions, any recommendations, we have to at first be given acknowledgement that harm is being done. And it's easy to say this is what we have on paper, but for a lot of us, what we're looking at when we walk out at our doors is completely different from what's on paper. So I think that it's important to really acknowledge the harm that has been done from the start to create the distrust and to create the breakdown in the relationship between police and community. And community can be what you see as community. Community can be who engages with people that you live around. Community can be whoever takes care of you. Um, it's very clear that a lot of us came on this task force because we don't feel that police are protecting and serving. And we know that there are some police officers who do their job with the utmost respect, but especially in this light, we have seen a lot of ugliness. And, you know, I think it's important to address that.
Sheba, this is Colette McKeechin. How would you best suggest acknowledging the harm?
It's a long start. I mean, you know, there are conversations that are shut down when we say things are at the discretion of police officers when we're talking about harms. Like in our conversations, we talk about different things that happen, and we know that a lot of complaints that people have are not going to be addressed or will be dismissed because they say it's at the discretion of the officer. I think this is important that, from a community standpoint, people understand, and I think this goes back to the education piece. People understand that the police can come in and give us the information about what their job is, but nobody takes the time to stop and say, what does the community feel and how are we feeling about these interactions? We talked a lot about putting out a public access channel to talk about what the police role is. Nobody is reaching back to say, how do we feel about these interactions in the community? So I think that when we're talking about healing, we absolutely have to listen to the community because we're all a very diverse task force, but we are a very, very, very small population of the people. So I don't have all the answers on what it is, but I know that day to day, everybody that I talk to in my personal experiences, I don't feel like I have the authority to go to your office and say, this thing happened to me. Will you take care of the investigation piece? Because we already look at it and say, this will be blown off. This will be put in a report as resolved without any actual resolution. And that is how we built up to this point that we're at right now. So, I don't have in the long way of it, I don't have an answer as to how it can be addressed, but I know it needs to be addressed.
I'd love to chime in on that if I can, because I think that, in addition to all of what Sheba just said, which I think is 1,000% accurate, we also have to, part of acknowledging the harm is more than just nodding in agreement that we recognize that there are inequities and other polite words that we'll use that exist systemically without changing those specific inequities. So it's like we've had these conversations, from my perspective, in a context of suggesting that, okay, for all of the purposes, if we just adjust a few things here or we tweak a few things here, then we'll, for lack of a better term, correct the issues that are at hand. And part of that acknowledgement or part of how we address it is recognizing that we have something with which we have to genuinely be willing, to dismantle and replace. It isn't necessarily always about reform. Some of it has to be completely done away with and replaced. That I think that is something that I raised in the last conversation we had. This whole notion of reimagining is not just reforming. It's just that. It's reimagining. Let's put on the table what are all of the options, what are all of the possibilities that can genuinely and authentically address the issues that community members are experiencing and that we know that exist, that contribute to the oppressive, to the inequitable, to the disparate, to the repressive practices that are enacted within the community. Like we can't suggest or ignore the fact that those things are in place and for all other purposes figure or feel that we'll heal or we'll repair in some other areas. And from my perspective, I feel like when we engage in conversation, we don't always do so from that vantage point. And so I part of the answer to that question has to be with not just acknowledging those inequities and the issues that have to be addressed systemically, but then considering in the process of developing resolution, how we are genuinely going to eliminate those factors.
I would agree with you. I would just add to that. And I think before we can address the vulnerabilities of the community, you have to deal with the perpetrator first. Because I think opening up the wounds and acknowledging what has happened in the communities and the people who have been injured through this process, opening them up again to be vulnerable again for healing, knowing that we have not figured out the other side first, I think becomes, you risk harming the community, the same community that you're asking to heal. So I think in terms of, I would agree with you 100% until you put some of those parameters and safety mechanisms in place, then the healing really cannot start without risking harm to the group again.
Agreed fully.
Can you hear me?
No, we're having a little trouble hearing you. Is that you, Keisha?
I have no idea. I've moved to another part of my building. I don't know why. Can you hear me?
That's better.
That's better, yep.
And so Lisa, just piggybacking off of what you said, the group that needs to heal and somebody else could chime in, maybe Ram or someone who specializes in it. Can a group heal if the people that are causing the distrust, the hurt, if they are not willing to acknowledge that they are part of the problem? I think it's almost impossible for that group to heal.
Um,
Go ahead, Ram. I'm sorry.
I think like I put some examples of acknowledgement in the chat, and Keisha, I think the question you're raising is, I mean, it's a critical question. I want to echo a lot of what I heard too about before we can really formulate concrete solutions. We need to really get the information out, distill that, and come up with like specific questions that are also definitely informed by the community. And we need a definition of what do we mean by community. But to answer your question directly, I mean, that is, I'm going to say yes. And I'm going to explain how. And I'm going to use a specific example, or I'll use two examples. So one example is based around like sexual abuse or sexual harm, and the person who commits the harm never admits or never acknowledges that they committed the act, which is a prevalent problem that is, probably part of the underground of what we're talking about. And so at a certain point, the person who's been harmed can heal through something that we're starting to call self-justice, because you're not going to get the acknowledgement from the person who committed the harm. So what are the steps that you have to go through, or that you're going to go through, to basically heal yourself? So that's a process. And then maybe in terms of people of color, specifically people of African descent, who I don't know if we're waiting for, but we haven't received the legitimate apology or acknowledgement of the harm. And even when we think of situations like race, truth and reconciliation commissions, like in South Africa, as I put truth telling up there, storytelling, when that is not forthcoming, like there's a point where we're not going to give up on the debate or pressure around reparations, but we cannot wait for our harm and trauma to be acknowledged by a perpetrator that doesn't even realize in some cases they're doing it. And if they do realize that they're doing it, they're not going to apologize. That's where we have to create our own healing spaces, and we have to address our own healing. So it's kind of like building up our own immunity to confront these issues that aren't forthcoming and that we don't really need to wait for, that we can do ourselves. Like an idea might be black on black healing versus like this overemphasis on black crime. But basically around self-justice and self-healing, yes, we can do it.
Maggie?
So I agree, Dr. Burgott. I think that you bring up a really good point. I really like the context of the second example that you gave, simply because it does take the issue of empowerment. So the victims are actually taking control and charge of how and what their growth and what their transition and healing will actually be. Because the reality is that people will continue to be exposed to their abusers and their oppressors, and the perpetrator over and over and over again. And so unless we create that context for what that looks like, then people will assume that healing it has to involve apology, recognition, acknowledgement, so on and so forth. And so I think that perhaps that needs to be part of what this subcommittee does, is reframe what that healing actually looks like, so that we're not assuming this traditional idea of someone having to apologize or someone having to say, yes, I did hurt you. And I am, yes, still in your space, and I may continue to hurt you. So how can you heal in spite of that? That needs to be contextual.
So,
Yeah.
All right,
so
everyone, just really
when you
quickly,
say something,
I just want to acknowledge that I've seen a couple hands go up. So Daryl, Natasha, James, and Chanel all have their hands up, and Mr. Burley. So if we could, if Keisha, I believe that was you chiming in, if you want to respond to that, but then I want to make sure we get to folks who've had their hands raised. So we'll go Daryl, Natasha, James, Chanel, and then Mr. Burley.
no, I will allow the others to. I'm on my phone. I'm not getting good reception, and so I can't really see when the hands are raised, and I'm like outside trying to get reception. So you guys can go ahead, and then I'll chime in. But I want to give everybody else the opportunity.
Thank you, Keisha. All right, Daryl, we'll turn it over to you.
My hand was up so long I actually forgot what I was going to say. But part of this, I want people to. I do recognize that this committee, we're still in our early phases. I appreciate this conversation, but I'm also, I think what I was trying to respond to is what Sheba was saying earlier, in that we do have, I think there are a lot of different stories that we do have to kind of lift up in this process. But also I'm wondering if, as each committee is going about their work, do we need to maybe have some, I don't want to say standardized, but I think because we're talking about reimagining public safety, I think what we naturally come back to is the police, and what they're currently doing in terms of policies and practices. But in terms of what we're tasked to do as a task force is to, one, be able to assess accurately what we're talking about. And that's why I brought up the definition of community being different, because those folks that are in the west end of Richmond are going to have a total different interaction and perception, or even interaction, or even the way they're policed, than people, say, in the East End, right? And even some people in the East End being differently policed. But what I was saying is that I think perhaps each committee needs to also consider maybe some things that I'm also hearing in my committee is, one, being able to sort of assess sort of what we're trying to talk about, meaning how do we incorporate the community voice? Because I think a lot of times we're going straight to the police department, but how can we assess the community's perception of police in these areas, as well as figuring out what other natural supports in the community we can actually access, or maybe figure out as a recommendation to support, or maybe perhaps do more of. So, for example, I'm not on the community engagement committee, but I don't know, maybe perhaps there needs to be some sort of, like, I think Dr. Yutsi's presentation was very powerful, and for many people, they may not have received that, right? So maybe that needs to be a part of the storytelling, or maybe even part of the training. And I am taking it back to the police department, but maybe that needs to be a part of that. That was just my process as I was listening to people talk and think, because I think we also, as a committee, are tasked with coming up with recommendations. So there are a lot of gaps, is what I'm saying. There's a lot of gaps, and what we can do, what strong recommendations can we put forth as a committee?
Thank you, Daryl. And I just want to flag, that's such a great question, is how do we understand the perception of the police in the community? And I would flag that as a really important question for the community engagement and healing group, that we can't make assumptions here. We shouldn't make assumptions here. And so I think that's really important, that we think through a meaningful way, that we can gather some data from the community of experiences and perceptions and put that forward, because I think that's so important. I just want to flag that as appreciate that question, Daryl, because I think that's really getting to a lot of the heart of what a lot of us have been talking about. Natasha, I had you up next. Natasha, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you now.
Okay, sorry, I had to switch to my phone. I just wanted to make a comment about accountability, and how I think that if we start from there, since that is what has kind of lit this fire in the first place, if we start from accountability, I feel like we would actually get somewhere. But if we try to maneuver in a way that doesn't allow for accountability to take place, then we're just a dog chasing our tail at that point. So even in in our subgroup, in the community subgroup, there's that seems to me, at least from what I am hearing, that seems to be a common thread of what's causing the discourse and conversation, is the lack of accountability. So I think, I just think that maybe we should start there, or at least incorporate accountability in a much greater way than we are currently.
Thank you, Natasha. I agree. I think that's a great question, a great point that needs to be addressed. Let's see. I had James up next.
Hey Maggie, how you doing? I just wonder, why do we think that these communities will ever heal from this? Because me being an individual that's been wrongfully charged with possession of a concealed weapon, and the only way I got out of the actual charge was I had to go to court and fight my way out, and I didn't take the plea and I won. So imagine those individuals who didn't have those resources, who actually took the plea and have felonies on their record right now, and they feel like they've been wrongfully convicted, and this felony is going to be there for the rest of their lives. So why do we feel a person's ever going to heal from that? I just don't. A lot of these cases, I don't think they will ever heal from it until those felonies are removed and that barrier is taken off of their lives. Because we can sit in circles and all of this stuff all day long, but the reality of a lot of this situation, if you can't find a job, you can't rent a house, you can't do all of these things, how do you heal from that?
Who's next? Because I can say something about that. That's a very good point.
I believe Chanel's up, but Chanel, if you're okay with it, we'll have maybe Ram chime in, because I don't want to leave questions unanswered.
Yeah, I just want to say I hear what you're saying, and it's like probably we won't heal permanently, but at the same time, we definitely did not want to buy into the mindset that we cannot heal from trauma. It's just like my brother was shot and killed. That's probably something I'll never heal completely from. It's always going to be a trigger, but there's a process of healing that we go through, mourning, grieving. There's a process and strategies that we can provide to like help youth and families traumatized by gun violence and everything. Structurally, there's a lot of things that we have to focus and work on, but like when we can't change the fact that there's this rampant gun violence, we can still, probably more than anything else, we could still provide a process for helping families, helping youth heal from the trauma of gun violence. So I just want to make sure like that the idea of healing is not this miraculous thing of it's all going to be gone. Healing is a process of like, how do we, reestablish our our connections and our relationships and things like that. So it's possible to heal even within all of this trauma, this urban trauma that we're dealing with.
Ron.
And to that point, because I think Ron was talking to me, I think the only difference in that is when a loved one died, which is God forbid, that still is not the same thing as having a felony on your record suppressing your life and you can't breathe, so you're stuck to committing the same crimes just trying to survive because you can't get a job. That's a whole, that's a sad thing, but that's a whole different scenario, because now we have individuals who are going to prison, coming home, can't find a job, but going back into the streets again. So it's a never-ending cycle. Some ending up on drugs very bad because they can't deal with it and they can't get that thing off of their neck. So I'm really trying to figure that out, because I talk to guys and females who this lack of hope, we talk to these people every day and they can't breathe. They cannot breathe. And even still to this day, when I see that particular cop, which I don't have to say no names, and he knows what he did, we still have this kind of look that we give each other. Still to this day, I deal with that, and I work for the city government right now. So imagine those who feel like drugs were planted on them. I know dudes who in their hearts, minds, and souls, that drugs were planted on them, and they got to deal with this for the rest of their life. But we're telling them to heal. The only thing they're going to want to hear is, you remove these felonies off my record, then I'll heal.
I'll just say we need to talk more about self-justice, James. That's all.
Thank you, but I think that's definitely a conversation that we need to have more time to have than we have today together. But I've made a note, and I think we should come back to it. All right, I'm just being conscious of our time. We've got about 9 more minutes within this kind of section. I just want to make sure we have all subgroups get an opportunity to discuss their work this week. So we've got 4 more folks who want to contribute to this subgroup conversation. So Chanel, I have you next, and then Mr. Burley, and then Lisa, and then George.
Okay, I'm going to try to do my best to speak over my son. I'm sorry. So my comment was especially around the self-justice piece. I think that's a skill that will take some time for our communities and anyone really to develop. But I also think that this accountability piece is going to be key, which is what was mentioned earlier. I think that if we continue to keep trying to ask our communities to bend and mold and just accept the same thing over and over again, and then try to maintain a positive relationship or see or view individuals in a positive light that have wronged them, and we keep sort of reinforcing this narrative that it just can't be done. We can't get an apology. We can't get a recognition of a wrongdoing. We can't get this. We can't get that. But we want our communities to continue to bend and mold and keep accepting it. I think we're going to continue to be in the same place. So in this process, I would like to see us really hone in again on that accountability piece and think about, how do we change the narrative for, those within these agencies around public safety, to creating a norm to where if there is some wrongdoing or some harm, that it's addressed, and that it is particularly from their perspective, there's a sort of shift or a change in how they respond to that and do more to push these agencies to reflect on it and call it out and do whatever needs to be done to address it so that communities really can heal.
Thank you, Chanel. I've made note of your comment as well. I think that's, I think the way that you talked about that and accountability and I think we could definitely, I think having attended each of the subgroup meetings, I know that there are definitely items related to accountability in each, and I think we just need to map those out so that everybody can understand the different approaches to that and how we can dig deeper. So I've made note of that. All right, Mr. Burley.
I think that a key component in this whole discussion is when we talk about healing in communities, one of the key conduits that we have overlooked or not given thought to is the church. Many of these areas in the city that are specific areas that are at difficult locations, you have some of the strongest churches. And I think a conduit to the community for where our weaknesses or our greatnesses are as police officers, much can be learned not only from the people living in these communities, but from the church congregations and the people related to the people who go to the churches who are not in the churches, but on the streets doing the crimes or in their neighborhoods that are being subjected to these conditions that we're all talking about. Awareness is a key factor, bringing these communities involved in creating awareness that the police department and the city of Richmond, per se, the mayor and ourselves, are we reaching out and learning and acquiring knowledge to make us aware also. It all comes back to the perception of the folks on Hillside Court may be entirely different of police officers than what the perception is generally of the people living on Church Hill, or more specifically, Mosby Court. So that awareness, perception, and church are three elements that I think will enhance and complement the healing and community objective that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burley. Made note. All right, Lisa.
So thank you very much for the time. I again apologize for stepping over people earlier. I just have two comments, and part of that is that one of the comments is that I think we have to change the narrative that the forgiveness falls on those who were wrong. So I think that we have approached healing by talking to the people who were hurt. But we have to begin to address the people who did the hurt. And so I think that is kind of the reason that we're here today, is to begin to address the other side. And so that we're not asking the people who were wronged to forgive. Because we are always in that dynamic of waiting for the other person who was taken advantage of or mistreated to turn the other cheek. And I think that speaks volumes to where some of this uprising has come from. So when we pivot and begin to address the individuals who have done the wrong, I think it helps the other group to begin to heal, because it does give their voice power. And so I think that changing that narrative is going to be critical. I want to also speak to Mr. Frazier's comment about doing focus groups. I think the focus groups are wonderful. I think it is a very academic approach to being able to address what is going on in a community that you don't belong to. Because you're coming in and you're asking questions because you don't know. But again, I think that puts the onus of responsibility on the person that was done wrong. And I think it gives them an incredible amount of burden to have to share what is the problem in their community with someone who doesn't belong to their community. I don't think it's necessarily a fair thing to do. I think it is an outsider perspective looking in. And when you do that in communities that have vulnerability and have had issues of not being heard, typically what happens is that they will withdraw and they decide that they're not going to give you anything because you should know better. You should have some awareness of what's going on in a community without you having to ask me a mundane question of how I perceive the police. I think that it is an insult in some ways to do that. I don't think it's coming from a place of wanting to insult, but I think it speaks volumes about what you don't know. And as leaders in the community, or people who live in these communities, mine included, I feel some kind of way about you asking me such a question, because you know what's going on. You have a sense of what's happening in the city of Richmond without you having to ask me how I feel about it, I think it just feels like an insult. So I want us to be really very careful about taking that approach, because it shows that you aren't a part of that community if you have to ask the question. That's all I have.
Oh, may I add one small thing to that? I am so appreciative of everything that you just said. I would add, if it is possible, not only are you right about the fact that we have to address those who are perpetrating the harm, but we also have to eliminate their ability to harm. We have to take away whatever that power is. I feel like part of our task is to eliminate the ability for harm to even be created. So we got to make sure that we're not just saying, and I'm not suggesting that this is what you said. I know that it's not what you said. But we can't just say, okay, well, let's talk to them or let's address them, but still allow them to have the power to commit the harm that have been committed for decades on end.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, Keisha, George has been waiting to speak, so can I come to you last? Yeah, thank you. George?
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
In the process of participating in this particular task force, because I'm on more than one, I oftentimes ask myself the question, how can you solve a lot of these problems for the Black community? And to me, really, we're really only talking about one community, and that's the Black community, because that's our community is the one that is experiencing the most abuse as far as with the police department. And that's why the focus seems to keep coming back to the police department. I can't see how that you solve one problem without solving the other. I took the time the other day, I was taking a friend of mine to the bus terminal, and I just so happened to see a police vehicle with 3 young Black police officers. So I walked over to them and I wanted to get their opinion of, what my view was, which my view is that I think that if more opportunities were created for African Americans in this country across the board, starting from kindergarten and not waiting until they're in the criminal justice system to start trying to do something. I kind of was trying to get their views of something like that. And so when I was listening to them, it sounded a lot like the establishment. These was 3 young Black officers. And one officer in particular, he and I, we were talking. And so I made the statement that, about young, unarmed Black men being killed. And I said, in most of the cases that I see, it's not really the thugs. It's not the ones that's gun-toting, pants below their waist, type of thug, hoodlum. These are usually kids that's really just trying to make their case on the street, and they don't understand that the situation has escalated to a point that they don't understand. And before they know it, they're on the ground, they're getting choked, whatever, and they're trying to state, what amendments they know about in the Constitution and all of that. And it just seems to get them in trouble. And so with these young police officers, he told me, he said, well, actually, Mr. Brown, he said, it's more whites that get killed unarmed than Blacks in this country. Now, see, I feel like that's a generic answer, because when you look at the percentage of Black people in the country, 13%, and you look at the percentage of whites in the country, 65 to 70%, then that means that you got to divide whatever number you put by 6. And so if it's 200 whites to 100 Blacks, that goes down to 30. And so when I hear those kind of generic responses from our own Black police officers, young ones that's, you know, on their way to being on the police force for a very long time, I wonder, how do they see our own people when they're policing us? They didn't tell me that they wanted to, you know, that they felt as though that Blacks being killed by police officers was good. But what they told me was that they were willing to see just how much intelligence I had to the information that dealt with ratios of our people being mistreated. And so I told them, you know, the same thing that I say to this group here, that as long as we are impoverished, that the policing is not going to change much. A civilization changes as people are given opportunity and lifted up. And Jesse Jackson talked about the boat being stuck at the bottom when he was running for president back in the 80s. And we're still the boat that's stuck at the bottom. And until these other issues are dealt with, like Brother James was saying, I really, you know, and Ram, I'm in Ram's group. And that's one of the things that I have benefited greatly from, is the ability of the healing circle. Because I'm looking at that as, okay, when they asked me the question, they said, what do you bring and what do you want to take from this? Well, what I'm getting from it is Ram's healing circle. So when it comes time to try to talk to my people in some way to try to heal us, then that's fine. But I really believe that the other committee that I'm on, you know, which deals with the economics of our people, is a big issue as far as dealing with policing, that they work hand in hand. Thank you.
Thank you, George. All right, Keisha, up on this part of the conversation. I just want to make sure we get to the human services group, and then if we have time at the end for additional questions or thoughts as folks are processing, then we can definitely use that. Keisha, you're muted.
Sure, I wanted to just ask a question because, like someone said, we focus a lot on the police, but we have the Commonwealth Attorney on here, Colette McKeachin, and as James alluded to before, being charged as a felony. And I just want to know, like, what your feedback is in terms of the criminal justice system and how it plays a huge part in what is going on with the distrust in the community, with just law enforcement, period. Because I feel like the criminal justice system, specifically your office, I have many kids that are 14, 15, 16 that your office has certified as adults, negating what they have gone through and the lack of resources that they have had, but yet the when they come in front of the office, none of that is certified as adults. And we have felonies, and we have a young lady on here that works with felons. And when they have felonies, the reality of the situation is it is hard for them to get jobs, and so they then in turn encounter the police more because a lot of times they do what they need to do or what they have to do to survive. And so I just want to get some kind of feedback from you specifically, Ms. McKeachin, in terms of how you like we're asking the police to take a and for you to speak a little bit more about that.
Hello? Hello?
Colette, we're getting a lot of feedback from on your end.
I see 2 screens for her.
Oh, okay. There we go. Is that better? Hello?
Yes, thank
Yeah,
you.
okay.
Thanks, James.
Ooh, thank you. To answer the question about felonies in the city of Richmond and both juveniles and adults having felony charges, my office and every attorney in my office recognizes how harmful a felony conviction, a felony charge, and a felony conviction can be, and how it can affect every part of any individual's life, from education to where you can live to filling out job applications. We understand all of that. So the policy in my office is twofold. First, if it's going to be your first felony, if you have had, 5 prior misdemeanor charges and you now have a felony, before we will go forward on a felony charge, that has to be approved by a supervisor. So that file is going to be looked at. The history of that person is going to be examined, whether it's a juvenile or an adult. And we are basically going to try to do everything reasonable so that the person is not convicted of a felony. So that's number one. And then number two, a lot of cases that begin charged as felonies are reduced to misdemeanors through the process of the case. And so you might be charged at the magistrate's office with felony grand larceny or felony malicious wounding or felony robbery. And then as the case goes forward, we work with the defense counsel, because we can never talk to a defendant. We're not allowed to do that. So all the conversations we have in our office as attorneys have to be with attorneys on the other side. We never have a conversation with the defendant. But in having the conversations with the attorneys, we see whether or not it is fair to both the defendant and to the victim to have that case reduced, either because of the evidence, because of what the victim wants, because the defendant is willing to go into anger management or do drug treatment or do drug court or assess their mental health status. All of those things happen before somebody is convicted of a felony. So we try very strenuously not to convict people. And if you looked at the numbers that are generated by the Virginia Supreme Court as to the caseloads of all the jurisdictions in Virginia who are submitting all of their cases to the Virginia Supreme Court on a daily basis, the felony numbers in Richmond have dropped dramatically. I'm going to say by at least half, if not more, over the past 5, 6, 7 years. So Richmond is actually, even though we are a big jurisdiction, even though we have had 4 homicides in the past couple of days, is one of the jurisdictions that has, percentage-wise, the least number of felonies for its population.
Kim, I know that you might be hopping off soon, so if you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, I was just going to add to Colette's conversation. My name again is Kim Russo. I'm the Court Service Unit Director at the Court Service Unit that serves at the Oliver Hill Court Building Juvenile Court. And all the complaints from the police come through my intake unit. Those are very serious crimes, many of which are felonies, are often detained, and much like what Colette said, our data for this year, our numbers are very low, even for the felonies. But Keisha, I wanted to make sure you understood that my intake unit has a bit of discretion as allowed by the Virginia Code, and we divert as many complaints as possible when the police send them, because what the intake unit is able to offer is a diversion plan where we utilize an assessment for the youth and family. And depending on the result of that assessment, we put together a plan with alternatives that are specific to the risk need. And if a felony, depending on what that felony is, comes across from the complaint, we will divert it. And sometimes we divert more than one time. So hopefully that's helpful to you.
It's definitely helpful, and I know about your diversion program. I just don't know how to frame the question, but I'm sure it's disproportionately in terms of your felonies coming from a certain area of the city, disproportionately probably, and maybe I'm wrong, African Americans. And again, I'm on here to speak for a certain demographics of population that I serve, and I just see what's going on in that particular population. And so when people hear me speak, I'm speaking for that specific population that I see. And I just found out recently that you guys had a diversion program where you go to UMFIS or some other kind of facility that I never ever knew about, because I've never seen any of the children I work with sent to that facility. But I've seen them being 15, 16, certified as adults. I don't see the mitigating circumstances, 9 times out of 10, them living in poverty with a lack of resources that are provided to them. And, you know, like Colette, you mentioned some killings in the last couple of days. 2 of those kids was my babies. And so that's why I'm late for this call, because I just came back from checking on a family member of one of those kids. And so for me, I see the lack of resources that they have. I see the over policing in the community. I see the distrust in the community. I see how they are treated. And we just have to do something about it. And I feel like a lot of stuff could be done if everybody was trying not to, and I'm not specifically talking about you, defend themselves and talk about how good and how great these programs is that everybody has, and just let's get on here and get real about what's really going on. And so we could really make some change in the community and really reimagine public safety, because this is just ridiculous. And so I don't want to get into specifically what happened last night, Colette, or any police that's on here, but something happened. The cops were called out 4 hours later. It was a whole total different response from the police, because it was a police that was a target and not a child that was a target. And when we as people on here think that those calls should be treated the same, and that those people are the same because each person is a human life, I think that we're going to make some kind of change. But as long as we, whether or not we want to acknowledge it or not, hold somebody to a different standard, then it's not going to change, because we just have to we just have to like really get real. I love the statistics, I love the data, I love the reports, but let's like really talk about what's really going on. I know for me, you know, I might be like a little bit too extra because I'm talking about a certain demographics, and I know that some demographics is connected to law enforcement a lot, but I'm just going from what I see in the community, and the lack thereof, and the lack of compassion, and just the responses that we have coming from different parts of people in the community that have the power to do stuff.
Thank you, Keisha. I appreciate you contributing and bringing that up, and I think that definitely needs to be part of our conversations going forward. But I know that we have one last group to get to today to report out, so I want to make sure that we get to hear from them as well. So Tori, I will turn it over to you with Human Services Calls for Service Group.
Greetings, everyone. Before I start, I want to just acknowledge a thank you to Keisha, James, Sheba, and everyone else who are committed to making sure that our community voice is being heard in this process of those who we don't often hear from. So I appreciate it, and thank you for your commitment. And I just named 3, but there are a lot of us at the table who's committed to doing that. And so I just want to say thank you. Our subgroup is the group that are looking at the call for services from a human service lens. And we have had wonderful presentations. We got a lot of the data at our first meeting and that second meeting, we decided we wanted to look at very specific calls that were not so clear-cut criminal calls. We knew exactly what car accidents are with domestic violence and larceny, but we have this large group of calls that could be subjective. Those disorderly calls, suspicious activities, want to know a little bit more about mental subjects, but we also wanted to know some information around the officer-initiated calls. So we kind of broke that down in two categories. First, the Department of Emergency Communications did a wonderful job of breaking down those categories into subcategories. We looked at those, not only did we look at the data, but he went through and mapped out the data so we could begin to look at patterns and trends and look at what they call those heat maps. Where are these concentration of calls? We realized that a lot of the disorderly calls are really centered around businesses. They tend to do when a business owner and patron have a disagreement and the cops may be called. A lot of the suspicious activity is kind of moved more so in residential areas. A lot of that could be folk calling because something just don't look right. You know, their neighbors at work, the door is open, and so someone needs to go and investigate. Others could be, hey, look, I've been in this community all my life. There's folk hanging around. We've never seen them again. Some just don't feel right. Could you send someone? We also looked at the mental something, and all of this information that we got, not only did he report out, but he mapped out for us so that we could begin to look for patterns and trends. We realized that a lot of the mental subject calls were initiating from 3 major hospitals. They were concentrated around Chippenham, VCU Health Systems, and Richmond Community. So we began to see patterns of calls. The other thing that we had Dr. Lindstrom, John Lindstrom from RBHA, kind of give us an overview on the codes that was related to emergency services. So if someone needed to be detained, there were very specific codes that were attached to them. And then at that point, in some cases, when you have to detain a person, an officer have to be present for that. And lastly, we had a wonderful presentation from Ms. Giles from the Department of Social Services, because one of our goals is to see how can we remove some of these calls that are not police related from going into the police call system. We looked at second responders. We had a presentation on the pros and the cons, what worked well, what didn't, and maybe begin to look at a framework on how we can begin to reimagine policing from a more human service lens. Next week, we have a couple of committees that will present. We're going to we broke away from that first presentation of call for services. We want the police to bring us information and data around the police initiated calls. We want to kind of know where they're being generated at, who's being stopped, who's being arrested, what that particular information looks like, and if we can overlay it with some of the maps that we have from the disorderly conduct, the suspicious activity, and see, because right now we tend to picking up a trend, and that trend tend to be in very specific communities. After that, we're going to we did some resource mapping. We began to identify resources because if we want to move those calls away from policing, we got to know what's in the community and where they're at. So there's some resource mapping going on. We had a document about 116 or so services, resources in the community. We're adding to that. We mapped out some, we kind of did some overlay for where those resources are actually using their main addresses and mapped them out in comparison to where some of our more challenging communities are, in looking at what's actually in those communities. And we're going to also hear from the Office of Community Wealth Builders about just giving us an overview of some of the challenges they have serving some of our more hard to serve families and residents. And lastly, we have a wonderful group of committed residents, and they're responsible for looking at and beginning to propose a framework on how do we build capacity in those communities to begin to take ownership and begin to also address some of these issues that are really not police issues that should come back into the community. So James, Keisha, Daryl, and Robert with RBA League for Safer Streets, and Ms. Singleton is on that committee. And so we're really looking forward to seeing kind of what type of framework they come up with as we reimagine policing. But we're only doing it from the human service lens and trying to stay true to the data at hand, but looking for patterns and trends and what that means in our work for the long run. And committee members, please jump in. James, I see your hand.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Evans. And I just seen something in the comments, and I seen she would just put something in the comments, and it really just struck me about lived experience. I think to reimagine public safety, we have to be able to take lived experience and allow that to qualify for some of these jobs. Because if even Mr. Gordon and Ms. Mitchell in the city of Richmond didn't identify my lived experience and how it could transition to me being able to do the job, I wouldn't have never got this chance to do all that I'm doing right now in the city of Richmond and for our city. So just that seeing something, it just spoke out to me so much that we have to really look at, okay, how can we take this lived experience and maybe that becomes your degree to be able to apply for these jobs and then turn these individuals loose in their own communities to try to get in this fight to really help us. So I just wanted to say that piece. Thank you.
And James, I know that's going to be included in your presentation next week.
Sheba, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I just want to give to James and taking it back to Rom. I think that's how we heal our own communities. And I think that's how we alleviate a lot of the reliance on service calls to police. We have to, first of all, be suited with the resources we need to serve our community. But if we really are being real about removing some of these harms from our community ourselves, we have to have the resources necessary to make these things happen. Having a felony for the past 16 years, I think I have given more to my community than a whole lot of people who have degrees. I have a degree too, but you know that degree meant nothing when it came down to talking to somebody who overdosed last week, 3 people who overdosed last week, talking to people who lost their children, and addressing different things in the community that I went through, having lived with a felony for 16 years that I was wrongfully convicted of. Now that sparked in me to take initiative to go help my community, but I'm not rich. You know, I don't have a $26.9 million budget to house people that I want to serve, but I know for certain that they are worthy of being able to be housed and being able to be educated and fed and different things in spite of having a past conviction. So I think that is a good gateway to doing some of our own healing. I know we can't do everything, but I'm really interested in hearing more about the second responders, Tori, and the group, because I think that's an amazing idea. And I think that it really is going to take the community to be accountable to themselves more so than anything and make some things happen. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. Tracy had her hand up next, I believe. Tracy?
It was just to comment that I think Sheba is 100% right. We have to expand. The data is fine. It's what we've been given. And I think we have a duty to explore more on our own to do right by the community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Are there any other questions? I don't see any additional hands. Okay, John, I see your hand.
Tori, excellent job. And if it benefits the group, I'd like to share just a couple of pieces of information. One, there's a whole lot of activity going on now across the whole Commonwealth, and some bills submitted in the General Assembly that are in one way or another taking up the issue of services and assistance as opposed to policing, specifically in the mental health area. And so as I become more enlightened and see the progress, I would like to take the opportunity to report that back in our subcommittee and then make that part of our record. And the other thing I would share is we're just about finished putting together a webinar that will be streamed to the city next Thursday on all of the services that are available through RBHA. But I think it goes to inform some of the services that are needed in the community around diverting people from arrest. And so I'll share that presentation with this group as well.
Thank you, John. Are there any other questions or comments at this time? If not, we look forward to reporting back out to you all in about 2 weeks, and we might just have a draft of a plan by then.
Thank you, Tori. I appreciate that. I just want to acknowledge and all of the time that you all have put into these meetings over the past 2 weeks. I know that all of you are very, very busy and have your own jobs. Excuse me, that's my dog. But I know that you all have dedicated so much time to this, so I just wanted to say thank you again. And I just wanted to quickly acknowledge a couple themes that came up through our conversation today. You know, I think we definitely need to focus on accountability, community engagement, transparency, communication and education, healing, valuing lived experiences, resources for the community, giving those back into the community. And then I've heard a number of times kind of advocacy on the General Assembly or the state level as well, and how we can all come together for changes that are needed on the state level that might be preempted on the local level. So I just today in the 2 hours that we've been meeting, it was a very robust discussion and a lot of great themes came out of that. So appreciate you know, all of you taking the time today. Does anybody have any questions, comments, logistical questions? I want to just open it up as we've got a few more minutes left.
Maggie?
Yeah, James.
I just would like to see if at least one time would the group be able to go in some of these communities so we can actually talk to the people that we said we are doing all of this for. I definitely think that, because I don't think a lot of individuals on these calls have actually walked through those environments and actually seen how it looks or smelled how it looks or heard the voices of the people. So I definitely will, you know, want to make sure that the group does take some time to do that.
I agree. I think, you know, I think that's been part of the discussion today was how do we engage the community in a meaningful way? And I think we've heard varying perspectives on how we go about doing that. But I think to your and Sheba's point about hearing those lived experiences, I think can be really, really helpful to our work here. And I agree. I think that we should do a community walk together, socially distanced, or think of a way that we could bring some additional folks in to hear different perspectives that we might be missing.
Well, most of the time when we go out there, the community is definitely going to ask for things. So I want to make sure that the players that are at the table are actually connected to the resources that we can get the community what they need when they say. Because they're going to give us feedback when we go, Maggie. They always have some things that they do need. But with the individuals on this call, we have a lot of individuals that have a lot of resources within this task force. And I want to make sure that when we do hear things, that the group as a whole can respond to what's heard.
Absolutely.
Maggie, can I jump in for a second?
Please.
Yeah, I also think that we might want to take up some offers that were made by the police to do some ride-alongs as well, just to help inform our opinions about what's going on some of these calls for service. I think that could be helpful. And another point, my last point, is that I've really enjoyed the Human Lens Committee. Really, I've learned a lot. And one of the things I've learned is that there was a mention made just a few minutes ago about second responders. And that's something that's really interesting to learn more about. Clearly, that is a direction that probably we need to go to have a significant movement back towards that. Though I was surprised to learn that when that program started off as a grant program, then extended, apparently it was later criticized, and I didn't really understand why. But then we learned from Ms. Giles that there are real constraints on the Department of Social Services about what they're permitted to do, what they're funded to do. And so I think that as we continue to have these discussions, as we find where we need to do more and do better, that part of our ask may be that we shouldn't just follow along with some of the state legislation. It is particularly in a city like Richmond, we're going to need to have some help from the General Assembly to address these extraordinary circumstances. So I just want to make that point.
Hey, Maggie.
Go ahead. Go ahead, James.
I just want to make a quick comment. So, based on what the gentleman said, for some of us that really operate in these areas, those ride-alongs are very dangerous for our lives. That's a very sticky slope for some of us that's actually in these communities to do, because once you're seeing it, that's very dangerous for a lot of us that are actually going in these communities. I'll say that.
Can I jump into about this? Let's go do the walk around into a particular community. And I want to bounce off what Dr. Moon said earlier too about the perpetrator. If we're going to walk some communities, let's walk all different types of communities, because there's things happening in other communities, where the problems of institutional structural racism really originate, and where a lot of work needs to be done. So I just want to kind of divert us from this mindset that we're going to go into the community that's most affected, and we're going to be walking through this community, and we're going to be like, okay, here's where we're seeing this and we're seeing that, and we got to, and I definitely do not want us going into these communities with this deficit mindset of all the problems that have been misdiagnosed. You know what I'm saying? And I want us to kind of expand the fact that when you think about the protests were not all Black people protesting. There were white people protesting, Latino people protesting. So when we're reimagining this public safety piece, let's expand our thoughts to what's happening behind the scenes that's not publicized in other communities, and stop targeting communities even more that have already been targeted.
I agree 100%, Ram. And yes, who's that?
Hey, this is Councilman Jones. Ram is about to make me just jump out my seat. I really appreciate everything he just said. He has no idea. Representing the 9th District, which has the fastest growing Latinx population in the city, I have a school that is 92% Latinx enrollment. I'm not going to say, well, I can say this. I don't know if we have done a good enough job on this task force to have Latinx representation. And I know we just lost a person, Brother Guzman, who is resigning from task force for different reasons. But I just want to at least share the fact that, you know, we don't have enough representation with Latinx community. That as we walk and go out into the community, we've got to make sure that we go out to where our brown brothers and sisters are living to ensure that they have a voice in this process of reimagining, because this isn't just black and white anymore. And so, you know, I literally have just been listening the whole time, but I could not say anything after Ram said what he said. So, my brother, I appreciate you lifting up other communities, and I want to make sure that we keep other communities outside of our own individual communities lifted up here and thought about. So, Brother Ram, God bless you.
Councilman Jones and members of the task force, this is Lion Sanchez Concha, and I've been listening, and I'm glad this came up. I wanted to mention, you know, that Alex Guzman shared a footage of something happening, and, you know, that brings down the Latino representation on this body to me, and that's not proportionate to the population of the city of Richmond, and I think that's something we need to take care of immediately. I'd be happy to make some recommendations, but I don't think it should be my responsibility also to help. But we really do need to represent that. I'm not a criminal justice expert, and I can bring my expertise in education, but I also know that in education, if we had a video of somebody shoving somebody and then smirking, there would be repercussions, you know, and I understand why Mr. Guzman has stepped out of the task force, and I stand in solidarity with him. But I also think it's important to have the representation of this body, and I just want to echo again. I wanted to mention that, but I also want to echo again my appreciation for everybody here and for everybody for everything that's being brought up today and through the times that we've met. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Jones and Lyons. I appreciate those comments, and Ram for bringing that up. I think that's exactly, you know, the intent behind what we were talking about earlier as well. And appreciate your comments, Lyon, about making sure that the Latino community is fully represented on this task force. And I will certainly work to ensure that that happens. All right, we are 2 minutes past 5 p.m. and I know that all of you have busy weekends ahead of you. Hopefully time with family and friends if you can. And so I just wanted to say thank you again for committing your time to this and for the hard work that we are all doing here together. And that's all we've got for today. Thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a great weekend.